Now, for your viewing pleasure, I'm going to discuss some of the things you need to know about a new filter found in Photoshop CS2 called Smart Sharpen. Now, I've discovered some things about this that might help you when using this or choosing the correct sharpening filter for your particular project. Now, whenever I'm testing a new filter, I always like to bring open a grayscale ramp like the one you see here in the image behind my dialogues. This grayscale ramp helps me analyze just what's happening inside of this new filter. So I'm now going to select Smart Sharpen and bring open the dialog as you see here. I'm going to move my cursor into the image area here, click and hold with the hand tool that appears, and move my graphic up just like this so we can see what's happening. Now, let's go in step by step and take a look at some of these features found here in Smart Sharpen. As you can see, there's a basic mode and an advanced mode. I'm currently in the basic mode. Let's just see what happens here. Start with, I'm going to select the amount and move this all the way over right there. A little bit of change happened, but not much, because we need to adjust the radius, the width of sharpening around the areas of greatest contrast. As I move this over, you can see it happening. Notice the areas of greatest contrast between the bands of gray is the area that's being affected the most. And thus we can expand on this radius around those areas to make it small or large radius around the areas of greatest contrast. Right? So let's crank these way up here so we can see the effects. And then check this out. I can remove different types of blur. In this case, I have selected Gaussian blur because that's how I blurred this graphic. But if you had blurred it with a lens blur or even a motion blur, you could set those here to zero in on the type of blur you were working with. Of course, with a motion blur, you can even determine the angle of the motion, as you can see down below here. I'm going to stay with Gaussian blur for this project. Then, cast your eyes down here to more accurate. More accurate can be best described as more intense. It is exaggerating the contrast and exaggerating the sharpening across the image. I'm going to turn that off for this project because I don't need that particular accuracy at this time for this project. Now, those are the settings we can do with just the basic settings. Now check this out. This is what makes Smart Sharpen so smart. Selecting Advanced. As you can see, we now have 3 tabs: Sharpen, Shadow, Highlight. You're saying to yourself, this means we can isolate the differences between highlights and shadows. Let's give this a try. Let's start with highlights. I'm now going to select Fade. If I move this to the right, watch the highlight shades within the image. Just a little bit of change up here in the upper right-hand corner. That's because our tonal width is at 0. Watch as I increase the tonal width, the number of tones which are being affected by the fade. See that? Wow. So, by adjusting the tonal width and fade, I'm essentially masking, yes, imagine a mask hiding the sharpening that we set in this first tab. So I can then hide the sharpening in the highlights. Wow! I guess I can also hide the sharpening in the shadows. Selecting the Shadow tab, then moving the fade over, then the tonal width. Check out the shadow detail. Great! That is powerful. Toning back the highlight sharpening, toning back the shadow sharpening. Now, radius, the final element here, it's very, very, very subtle adjustments in this particular case. I get my greatest adjustments out of tonal width and fade amount. I combine the two together to then isolate my sharpening to the exact regions within the shades that I'm working on. Wow! This is a great capability. Let's apply this to a real-world project. I'm going to click Cancel right now. Then let's go back here to our second image in the background here, an image by that incredible photographer Martin Evening. This portrait needs a little bit of sharpening. Let's apply some of the things we learned about Smart Sharpen to this image. First, I'm going to take this image and duplicate it by clicking here within my Layers palette, dragging it to the base of my Layers palette onto this icon, and thus I have a copy of my background. You'll see why I've done that after I've sharpened the image. So now, with this second copy selected, I'm going back up to Filter, Sharpen, Smart Sharpen. Now once again, let's keep in mind the image is made up of tones that we can control. So let's sharpen the image first with the basic settings. Bring up the radius. Let's do this not that extreme, but maybe something more like this. We want to go a little bit extreme because I'm going to show you why. I want to go a little bit farther than what I had intended to do for this image. But now let's select Advanced, and let's use some of the things we learned from the first graphic and apply them here, because we can go into the shadows and start to adjust how much of the sharpening is taking place in the shadows. I'm going to pull this back a little here and pull back here on the tonal width to start controlling that, then move my cursor into the work area and click and hold, and I can see a before and after on the sharpening. I'm going to leave the shadows where they are now because it's the highlights in this image that I want to tone back. Remember, it's like a mask. I'm going to fade the amount here under the highlights, then expand my mask. You can see some of the sharpening coming out of her cheek and the tones around her nose as I move this over. Let's double check by moving my cursor back into the work area, click and hold. I can see that I'm starting to preview the fact that my sharpening is focused mainly on the darker shades in the image. I'm eliminating the highlights here by adjusting them with fade and width and maintaining a little bit more with the shadows before and after. Great! Now, this is really close to what I'm looking for because I can control the highlights and shadows, but now I'm going to click OK. As you saw inside the dialog, I set the values to be a little bit more extreme than what I wanted, because you can first go back into this second layer we see here and adjust its opacity. Before I do that, I'm going to quickly zoom in here on our image so you can see these changes more clearly. Then, here from my opacity settings in my Layers palette, I'm going to click and hold here on the word opacity until I get this quick and easy way of adjusting this setting here by clicking and dragging with the scrubbing tool. And then I can adjust the overall opacity for that layer, 0 all the way to 100. So that's one way of then blending the sharpened version into the non-sharpened version, so I can have steps in between. The second method I wanted to show you is with a layer mask. Going down here to the base of my Layers palette, clicking on Add Layer Mask, just like that. Then, as you can see, I have a brush tool selected here from the tool palette. I can move into my work area and start to paint. My current opacity for this black brush is set to 20%, as I see here in my options bar, and my flow is set to 50%. I'm going to bring my flow all the way up to 100%, like that, and leave my opacity at 20%. I like to gently paint in these effects rather than something that's too harsh and abrupt. So now, painting with black at 20%, I can go in and paint into the mask and remove the sharpening in the critical areas around her cheek here and the tones in her face. I don't want this detail to be sharpened. I'm pulling back on that with a mask. We can see this mask in several different ways. First, I can hold down the Option or Alt key and click here on the mask in the Layers palette and see the dark regions of the mask here. Once again, with the Option or Alt key clicking on that mask, we then go back to the original. Now, as you can see, we can go through and paint through this image and then limit the amount of sharpening in those areas. Let's zoom back out by double-clicking on the hand tool to see our entire image like this. So there you've just seen a great new way to sharpen images. Combine that new filter with techniques like layer masks to get your best results.